Hey, so I just want to do a quick demo on SQL injections. And really what prompted this was I got this template here of a series of questions, I guess, to prepare for an interview. And I was thinking to myself, well, what would be a good way to demonstrate kind of well-rounded knowledge to cover most of these, right? If not, try to get all of them, but as many of them as possible into a practical demo and exercise, also to refresh myself with Java. And I thought, well, why not do an SQL injection and show how input validation is very important when we're talking about coding. And particularly, we're going to be focusing on uh, two lines of code in our user controller class. Specifically, it's going to be these parameters. So we're going to have two options, and we're going to see how each of these options react to our inputs. And when we're dealing with the first part, all right, we're dealing with a string essentially that gets concatenated with the username and password gets converted into a query string. And the problem with this is that it's exactly the same as just sending the SQL query directly to the database, which is very bad because that's when we can have issues like SQL injections. Now, in the second option down below, this is where we're doing placeholders instead. So these question marks allow us to represent the parameters instead. And so rather than directly inserting their values, all right, the query uses a placeholder and it's following some form of essentially binding where the values are bound to the placeholder. So the database is going to treat this as the data rather than as part of the query or the syntax. Now, I'm just doing this demo with the assumption that you already have your virtual machine, you already have your databases. I think after having done this myself, I'm going to revisit this and probably do probably a more thorough one and do it from start to finish. But essentially what I'm working with here is just I'm using IntelliJ for the project. I'm using Python to run a HTTP server for myself locally on my machine. And I'm using MariaDB with my tables and my username and password in place. Now, key components about this, we're using the Spring Boot here. This allows us to be able to have certain configurations to be able to just kind of get up and start running, especially where we're using trying to build something web-based. In this case, I'm just building it locally, but still, I'm going to need something to handle those protocols over HTTP. I have a very simple index file. So of course, in your application properties, you're going to want to include what database you're using. Of course, database username and password. These are arbitrary here. And the database that you're using, in this case, my Java database controller is going to be with MariaDB. And of course, you're going to need, at least in the very basic elements, your index.html file, and you're also go in your resources, your static resources, and a user controller that's going to handle the request for login. So in our first example, we're just going to go ahead with the wrong type of syntax, again, where we're just passing the query directly when we do the login. So let's see what happens. Here we have our login. I'm going to put in my admin and my admin password. If we log in here, we get welcome admin. So here my login is working correctly if I'm putting in the username and the password. But let's say we put in a SQL query that's going to escalate our privileges. All right. So here I have, I'm going to be putting in an SQL injection that I prepared here. All right. And the way that this works is that we're using a classic SQL injection, if you will, very basic technique, where we're going to be working with this single quote. And this is what we're using in order to close the string prematurely. With the logical operator OR, that's going to allow us to combine multiple conditions. And so in this case, we're introducing a condition that is always true, a Boolean condition where 1 is always equal to 1. And with these dashes on the end, we're saying to essentially ignore everything else after it. So whatever is the original query, all right, essentially we're using an injection that's going to allow us to be able to escalate our privilege and be able to log in. So if this was a properly coded site, this wouldn't work. But the problem here is that it's reading the SQL statement and it's converting that syntax and sending it directly to the database. So now when we log in, you can see we actually get a welcome message here. And it's actually welcoming us in, and we're able to log in just by using an SQL statement. Now this is wrong. This is not good. This is not ideal. Granted, again, remember, we're just doing this in a very basic demo environment, But think of the implications that there is to this. If you do not do proper validation or input validation, or you're not handling user input correctly, especially for login, and it's being sent to the database, well then there's different types of SQL injections that can be used to be able to get data or be able to escalate one's privilege and log in as an administrator. So let's go ahead and fix that. Remember, in our first demo here, right, the problem here is that we're using parameterized queries, where it's essentially just concatenating the user input and then sending the query directly. Now, let's go ahead and make a change and make an improvement where instead we're going to be using placeholders instead. And what's very nice about these placeholders is that rather than essentially just sending out a concatenating statement with the queries, instead what we're going to be doing is that the query is going to be using placeholders, which are going to represent the password parameters for the parameters for username and the password. So this is going to increase the security, because by using placeholders, we're going to make sure that the inputs are treated as literal values and not as executable code. And not just that, it's also going to allow us to be able to handle the database more delicately, if you will. So let's go ahead and make these changes. We're just going to be modifying 2 lines of code here in our project. Oh, having trouble with copy and paste there. There we go. So now that we have these placeholders in place, let's go ahead and actually stop running this here. All right, let's save our updated project. And let's execute this again. Perfect. Now that we're running, let's go ahead and check our application. So now what I'm expecting this time, all right, is if I were to try to use the SQL injection, I should get a rejected statement. And yes, in this case, now we have login has failed. Why? Because it's no longer reading the user input and converting it into a query and then sending it directly to the database. Instead, it's now using placeholders that are going to represent the parameters for the username and the password. And rather than you inserting their values directly, all right, it's going to be binding the username and the password to those placeholders and be treating that as data rather than as part of the query syntax. And that, my friends, is a very simple way of just doing input validation and a very basic way of demonstrating SQL injections, mainly user input handling for logins. Now, I had a lot of fun doing this. I mean, it was good to kind of refresh myself on Java. I think what I'll do is recreate this and probably send it to an S3, excuse me, an EC2 machine to be able to host it on AWS. And my reasoning for probably putting this on an AWS server is because I would like to have something very similar to demotestfire.net, which is a web page that is dedicated to showing how how to make a bad website, essentially. Because even here, we can also use an SQL injection. So here, let's go ahead and force ourselves to be admins. So let's go ahead and use an SQL injection here to be able to escalate our privilege. And there, we're an admin user. So I'd like to make something like this, and I think it would be a good refresher for me to do this in Java. But anyways, localhost example of just being able to build something very quickly on Java, and to demonstrate the SQL injection and the importance of input validation and handling values inserted by the user.